Hi, I'm comic book artist Mike Stewart. In this video, we are going to be going through the process of how I created this female barbarian pinup for my art book Uncut. Settle in, learn, enjoy, and let's get started. Hi. So at this point, I've established the gesture and I've already done the construction portion for the drawing. And what I'm really doing right now is I am sculpting out the forms that I have already established. So I went over the drawing with a Kneaded Eraser to lighten up the lines. And I'm essentially using the pencil as a sculpting tool. Sculpting is by far one of the most important things that you can take into account when you are doing your drawings. The reason behind this is because it kind of essentially solidifies the form within your imagination, which goes a lot into your visualization of what you're wanting to put down onto the actual paper. You'll notice that I have a paper underneath my drawing hand for most of the time throughout this tutorial. That essentially serves as a way to keep the drawing clean so that I don't smudge any of the line work that I put down. And of course, it's small because I don't want to use a bigger piece of paper. I don't want it to cover up too much of the drawing. I want to still be able to see it as I'm constructing it. So right here you can see that I'm holding my pencil further back. It's so that I can see the face as I put in little delicate lines. You kind of have to look at it like when you're drawing a face, like you're putting makeup on that face. You don't want to like smear it all over the place. You want to actually see what you're doing. Here I'm sculpting out the hair. I'm thinking in terms of geometrical shapes. You don't want to draw strand by strand, and that's something that a lot of beginner artists don't realize. They try to draw hair with each individual strand. The way to go about it is to break it down into large clumps, like geometrical forms. Um, Another important thing to think about when you're drawing hair is the lines of beauty, so to speak. So you don't want to have both sections of hair shape to be symmetrical. You want to have a lot of asymmetry in there. So in simple terms, that means you'll have shapes that taper off. They're not going to be the same volume from beginning to end. So you'll have a thick section of hair that can begin from the root of the hair, and then you'll have it taper off when it goes to the extent of the hair. And you also want to make those shapes interesting as well. You don't want them to be too flat. And in terms of being flat, what I also mean is creating depth in your drawing. So you want to draw something that's convincing, that has some type of form and depth to it. Because what we're doing here is we're drawing things that are make-believe. They're not photorealistic drawings. So you have to convince the viewer that these things actually can exist, or they have some sort of power and life to them. One of the most important tools in your toolbox to convince your viewer of these things is line weight. So if you notice right here, I'm adding a lot of different line weights to different parts of the drawing. Basically, I follow a few simple rules that sometimes can be broken, but a lot of it adheres to the actual lighting on the figure or the composition as a whole. Right here, I'm adding line weights to the boots. I'm keeping in mind that the boots have a sort of weight and volume to them. So I'll add line weights to whatever's further forward in space most of the time, and also the actual form itself. So if you have like a thin part on a boot or a shoe, you can delineate that with line weight. You can make it a thinner line and then have it taper to a thicker line on the heavier or thicker part of that form. And this idea of line weights also applies to the anatomy. So if you're going to draw uh, human breast or ligaments, muscle groups, you're keeping in mind the volume of that mass. So you'll indicate that with a thicker line or a thinner line, depending on the volume of that shape. And then keep in mind also that you're generally adhering to the light source in the picture, which would mean it would be above the figure most of the time. So your line weights would follow the rules of the light source. And that's what I'm doing here with the hair as well. I'm keeping in mind line weights, but I'm also making sure that the hair goes together compositionally and figuratively as a whole, which means there's not any particular areas that are extremely contrasted to the others. All the contrast is pretty much evened out, and it's not necessarily asymmetrical. It's more natural, so to speak. When you look at this drawing, you'll see some of the important line weights that I put in underneath the jawline where the chin is, on top of that underside of the neck there. You'll see a thick line. It also indicates cast shadow as well. So that also is played into the line weights. The part where the bicep and deltoid are connected to the torso, there's a line weight underneath there that indicates the form going over it. This is called overlap. Some of the basic rules in line weights are that objects closer to the camera have heavier lines than objects that are further away. So that means if you have like a hand coming at you in foreshortening, that tends to have the thickest line weights on it. Also, outer contours for figures and other forms are thicker than the inner lines, generally speaking. So what that means is the holding lines or the contour lines around a face or a leg or an arm, those lines are going to be thicker than, generally speaking, than what is inside of the forms. When you put more lines on the characters' faces, it tends to make them look older. So if you tend to do that, you are creating more forms on the face that aren't necessary, and that can be confusing visually to the viewer. Now, obviously, if you're drawing an older character, or if that character's face requires that you put more lines, then that's what you need to do. But generally speaking, more lines on the face make characters look older. Well, a quick coffee break here. A lot of times when you take a break from your drawing, you can kind of see some of the mistakes you've made, some things that don't quite look right. So you come back, reassess, and reattack. You can also turn your drawing upside down. This is the same thing as doing the mirror trick. It's where you put your drawing into a mirror, and then now you can see it from a stranger's eye. You can start to see, like, hey, maybe the eye is off, or the face is kind of skewed, and then you can begin to correct those things that you now see that you did not see before. So if you ever want some help with your drawings to improve them, one of the best things you can do is use the mirror trick. So a hand mirror can help you. Just put that next to your desk, have it with you as part of your repertoire of art tools. You can also pick up your drawing off the desk and hold it up to the light in reverse. So you flip the drawing, hold it to the light, and then it's the same thing as the mirror trick. It's your drawing in reverse, and it allows you to view your mistakes and move forward from there. Keep in mind when you're drawing props like boots and weapons and cars, even animals, you want to have a level of realism when you draw those, because you want to immerse people into that drawing or that world that you're creating. So it's very important that those things look real, because people can look at your drawing and tell whether it looks like a car or not, even if they don't know how to draw a car. They can look at your drawing and tell if that drawing of an animal looks like an animal or not, even though they don't know how to draw. People just have this encyclopedia of knowledge that they've visually built up through their lifetimes, whether it's children to adults. So if you don't know how to draw something from memory, don't be afraid to use reference. So if you're going to draw metal objects or boots that are made of leather, look those things up. Use Google and type it in, get photo reference, use that as you're drawing to get you a good idea of what those forms actually look like and what kind of textures they have. Nowadays in art school, pretty much all the teachers in those classes are going to tell you not to use reference. They're going to say that you need to come up with something from your imagination and not to look at other artists or not to use references. This is a giant fraud and misnomer perpetrated in today's modern art world. They're more focused on splashing paint on a canvas and asking the artists how splashing the paint made them feel. They're not in the business of picture making, so to speak, like you would be as a commercial artist, which are comic book artists, illustrators, people that work in the movie industry, concept art, etc. So do not listen to college and university art teachers. You just listen to the artists that actually create great art and that are successful. Because there's a reason why a lot of those teachers are teachers. A good portion of them chose that because they can't become successful commercially. So they revert to teaching and regurgitating what they've been taught by their predecessors. And a lot of this modern art movement, it gets so heavy into the political realm. So politically, they're going to tell you what to do and what not to do, but none of it really has to do with the techniques in your actual art, like how to draw anatomy, how to draw facial structures, how to connect ligaments, and draw sinew, to put veins on top of muscular forms. None of this stuff is stuff that they teach necessarily. They're more concerned about politics, emotions, expressions. When speaking on yourself and improving your own art, just always remember that nobody's gonna hand it to you. You're gonna have to work very hard for yourself and be motivated. You're going to have to practice. You're going to have to learn figure drawing, gesture drawing, anatomy, composition, proportion, balance, rhythm. You're going to have to learn a plethora of things that modern art schools just won't teach you. They're not interested in creating phenomenal artists. They're interested in brainwashing artists and taking your money. When I went to modern art school, this was after I already had become a professional comic book artist. Uh, I remember that when I was doing life drawing classes, a lot of the other students, they would actually gather around what I was drawing because it's a real tragedy. Um, because the teachers didn't really teach him anything. They wouldn't teach him proportions and anatomy and figure drawing. They would just, walk around the room, say, "Oh, that looks good," or "Oh, keep going, keep trying." It's just a lot of sayings that have no meaning to them. It didn't help these young artists. So when they saw somebody like me that was drawing figures that had proportions, anatomy, rhythm, balance, all that good stuff that a typical comic artist would include, it was like seeing an alien. Like they would gather around each time. People would like put their easels behind my easel to see what I'm drawing. That in turn helped them to complete their own life drawings from the model. Because the teacher just simply wasn't there. Even though the teacher's standing around drinking coffee, walking around, they're not doing anything meaningful to help these young artists. A lot of which were the same age as I am. If you do get the chance to go to school, such as a college or university or just art classes in general, always remember that your progress as an artist is ultimately up to you. Nobody's going to do that for you. No level of schooling is going to turn you into a great artist. Uh, that all lies within you. You have to be motivated. You have to put in the time and practice because nobody wakes up one day and then all of a sudden they're an amazing artist. Think of it this way: are there schools that are out there that you can pay to go to where they're going to make you an NBA All Star or an NFL All Star that's going to make millions of dollars per year? The answer is no. The same token with artists, there's not schools where they're going to turn you into this amazing world renowned artist. It's all up to you. Invest in yourself, put in the time and effort that it takes to get good, and then keep going past that. There's a saying in martial arts that, especially in Brazilian Jiu Jitsu, once you reach your black belt, that's just the beginning of your learning. So when people join, they look at it as, oh, the black belt is the highest level I can achieve. But when you talk to black belts, they'll tell you that no, actually their learning has just begun. And that's the same thing with artists is, yeah, you got to put in a lot of hard work to learn all these things, learn the basics, but your journey doesn't end. You're going to continue to always learn and get better. And even the oldest artists are always learning more. Example would be Frank Frazetta teaching himself to draw with his left hand. Right here, I'm delineating the skull forms. They're the bottom of the page here in the composition. Um, First of all, that giant skull shape, it provides an entry point into the composition of the drawing. So a lot of the classic, like Renaissance painters, they would use stuff like shoes in the foreground or animals to point the viewer's eye toward the direction of the main focus of the composition. So in that case, it would be the female warrior. Um, so you always want to make sure that these objects complement your primary focus in the composition, and go ahead and lead the eye in certain ways according to your design. Um, you want to be cautious not to over exaggerate or over delineate things that are not the focus of your composition. So if I were to put something really jarring or extremely abnormal into this skull form that you're looking at, that could distract from the main composition and destroy the composition as a whole. So what you really want to do is you make sure you maintain that balance. So it can be an interesting element, but make sure to never make it too overwhelmingly distracting. One of the ways I ensured that this skull element is subdued is that I made sure that the form of the female warrior, her overall abstract shape, is much larger and more interesting than the shape of the skull. So it's larger in volume and size, and the shape itself has a lot more interest inside of it, meaning her sword, the angle of her legs, her massive hair that has detail in it, her face has a lot of contrast, drawing your eye toward it. So you want your brain bouncing in and out of abstract thought focused on the drawing. What that means is you're keeping in mind the abstract shapes as you're drawing. So yes, keep in mind texture, form, rhythm, all that good stuff. But you also want to keep it in the back of your head, like, what is the figure composed of? Is it triangles, rectangles, squares? And then break that down in the simplest forms you can and keep that in your mind as you're finishing the composition, as you're adding sub elements that are in submission to the dominant element. It sounds very simple, but think in terms of shapes, the very basic shapes that you learned in elementary school or something like that. Think about squares, triangles, circles, rectangles, octagons, pentagons, all that stuff. That is what your composition is. It's just basic shapes organized in a pleasing way. So right here I'm adding details to the skulls. I'm keeping in mind not to uh, make it too simple, because essentially I want a almost gray tone on this bottom portion of the composition. That way that the viewer's eye stays in the focus, which is the female warrior. She has the most contrast, she has the most negative and open space around her. So with the bottom area where the skulls are, that's, think of it like a gray tone. So I'm kind of subduing the forms by adding detail to them. Other ways you can do that, other than what I'm doing here, which is texture, you can do a lot of cross hatching. You can even use color, ink wash, whatever medium you're using. Just think of terms of neutralizing something. So gray tone is a simple way to think about it. Right here I have some more skull shapes already blocked in, so I'm thinking about blocking them in regards to what we just spoke about, which is keeping it neutralized. So I'm spotting the same amount of blacks and detail essentially as I did with the skulls that are next to these forms, without making them too boring. So there is some variance within them, but they all generally follow the same rules of neutralization that I'm thinking about. And this is all when you're thinking of your abstract shapes and the overall composition. Because you don't want to get too lost in the details. You want to always have that big picture in mind because you're like the movie director. You're not the actor or the prop within that piece. You're the person directing the entire cinematic experience. Right here, I'm spotting more blacks than what appears to be otherwise in the other skull shapes because I'm leading your eye back up to the form above, which is the warrior. Uh, these little black forms kind of go together in a little pattern that leads your eye up to the pillar that she's sitting on and the other areas of black and cast shadow. So if you notice with this small cluster of skulls on the lower left hand side that I'm working on, they actually form an abstract shape as a whole together on that side. They form a triangular shape, and what that does for the piece is it leads your eye back up in an arrow shape that points up toward the dominant shape in the composition. If you look at the eyes on the skulls, you'll notice that there's another subtle trick at hand. I have the eyes pointed in very particular directions so as to not allow the viewer's eye to drift too far away from the abstract shapes. So I have their eyes keeping eye flow of the viewer within all the major shapes. It sounds simple, but when you have a character's eyes or even a prop's eyes, such as these skulls, facing a certain way and looking in a certain direction, the viewer's eye tends to look in that direction. And that's the same idea behind, in reality, if you see somebody looking up in the sky, you're kind of tempted to want to look up in the sky as well, and oftentimes you will. You'll look up and see, hey, what are they looking at? So it's the same idea when you do compositions in your drawings. Right here I'm building up more surface textures and little hatch marks on each form because most of the forms are pretty much complete as far as line weights and cast shadows and spotting blacks are concerned. So I'm going to start doing a lot of the final touch-ups on the piece here, which are uh, these little hatch marks indicate more form and kind of round out the skulls into their natural shapes. Keep in mind when you're putting details on forms that you don't put details on there just for the sake of having detail. Make sure they adhere to the volumetric forms that you're drawing. So in this case, the skulls are rounded. You're going to want to make sure your cross hatching or your hatch marks or whatever detail you're putting on top, make sure it rounds about the form on whatever form it is. So if it's a flat box, you're going to indicate that. If it's round, you're going to make details and shadows on there round off to further convince the viewer to what the form actually is. Right here I'm quickly detailing in the pillar to enhance the depth of the piece and the composition. So it's pushing the skulls further forward and the pillar and the character that is in front of it, as well as helping lead the eye toward that shape as well. Right here, my hand is further up the pencil so I can see the area that I'm drawing better. So I'm just carefully detailing the face and other parts of the drawing. I'm adding more black and shadow to give more form and depth to that pillar that she's sitting on top of. So the same idea behind drawing any buildings or architecture. You're bringing form closest to you forward and pushing the forms behind it further back. The same thing here. I'm pushing and pulling forms, so what needs to go further back in space, I'm pushing back by darkening it, and or adding more line weights, and then I'm pushing forms forward by keeping them open. And finishing up the drawing by signing my name. And thank you guys for joining me for this tutorial.